Wow. I mean, very rarely am I at a loss for words. Very rarely am I surprised at the direction that a media outlet is taking, especially when that media outlet's ESPN. I mean, the worldwide leader in woke, they have done so many questionable things in the past. Nothing surprises me anymore, but I got to admit, I was legitimately surprised this afternoon when ESPN proudly announced their new lineup for ESPN Radio. With the announcement of this lineup, ESPN is sending a clear message to their affiliates and the dozen or so listeners they have left. The message being sent with this lineup: ESPN is officially giving up on radio. They are throwing in the towel. They are submitting to their competition. They are openly admitting, we do not have the star power to compete. I think another problem is ESPN doesn't have the financial resources to go out and buy the star power to compete. With all these cost-cutting measures and the millions of dollars they are now saving on radio, it appears that ESPN has entered the early stages of being acquired. But that's a topic for another video. Now, even though terrestrial radio is not as popular as it was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, terrestrial radio, it is still influential. There is still money to be made in radio. According to Pew Research, nearly half the adults in this country consume their news through radio. 80% of the population, they admit to listening to terrestrial radio at least once every week. Now, to be honest with you, I found this to be very surprising. I thought these numbers would be lower. Me personally, I haven't listened to terrestrial radio since 2006. Soon as Howard Stern moved to satellite radio, I was done with regular radio. Like I have explained to you guys many times before, ESPN Radio used to be a dominant force in sports talk radio. Every year when Talkers magazine would release their Heavy 100, almost all the shows on ESPN Radio would make the list. The radio division back then, it was filled with star power. Father Jalen Rose at Woke United Methodist, he would have called it the Mount Rushmore of sports radio before he banned use of the term because it's triggering for shitfucks who are offended by our founding fathers. You had the original lineup: Tony Kornheiser, Mike and Mike, Colin Cowherd, Dan Patrick. They followed that up with Scott Van Pelt, Ryan Russillo, Mike Tirico, Will Kane. Now, I never thought that lineup was as good as the original, but at least it was respectable. About 10 years ago, ESPN made a decision that completely tanked their radio division. They centered their radio lineup around the failure of all failures, the inspiration for the term huge embarrassing failure, Bomani Jones. ESPN spent thousands of dollars promoting Bomani Jones, pretending like he was a rising star, claiming he was the next Stephen A. Smith. What was the end result? A loss of almost 100 radio affiliates and the lowest ratings ever recorded. Affiliates could not dump this loser fast enough. They begged ESPN, please, for the love of God, get this loser off my radio. We received the latest ratings report and Arbitron is claiming that our numbers are so low they are measured in single digits. Local radio affiliates, they ended up spending the extra money to broadcast local programming instead of the garbage offered by ESPN Radio. And ESPN has never recovered. They tried to recover, if you call putting Max Kellerman on radio trying. I always found this logic interesting from ESPN. When someone fails to draw ratings on TV, they put them on radio. They tried with Dan Le Batard. If I remember correctly, Dan Le Batard wasn't even number one in his home market of Miami. Yet for some reason, ESPN thought he could be number one nationally. They also tried someone named Shiny Aguamike. I was unfamiliar with this birthing person, and I'm still unfamiliar with the pronunciation of their name. I had to look them up. Didn't take me long to remember, though. Shiny Aguamike is better known here on the channel as The Chin. I gave her this name because after many attempts of not giving a shit how to properly pronounce it, I figured it was just easier to give her the nickname. Now, this was a very confusing decision by ESPN Radio. What made anyone think that a WNBA dump diver would be able to establish an audience on radio? If she can't attract viewers by showcasing her unique ability to airball wide open layups, What made anyone think she could attract listeners by giving her analysis on processing trash? Hey there, radio listeners, Tiny Agua Mike here. Let me explain how to get rid of that pesky garbage. You take the garbage can to the end of your driveway, and I'll come pick it up for ya. And now, with this latest lineup, it is becoming abundantly clear ESPN is giving up on radio. Matter of fact, we might have our newest nomination for the upcoming Hef Awards because this lineup has huge embarrassing failure written all over it. Well, KC, since they removed Mark Jones from NBA coverage, did ESPN move him to radio? No, but that would be a great idea. Mark Jones definitely has a face for radio, but I'm pretty sure ESPN's long-term plans for Mark Jones is to make sure that we forget that he exists. They want to hide him in the woke dungeon, never to be seen again, and I think all of us can agree that is an excellent plan. But listen to this lineup that is premiering on ESPN Radio next month. You tell me, if ESPN is taking its radio division seriously, you're going to start off your mornings with Evan Cohen, Chris Canty, and Michelle Smallman. Who? Who and who? Who in the hell are these people? Was Mina Kimes too busy polishing her stilettos to wake up at 5 in the morning to do a morning radio show? Could they not convince JJ Redick to lend him his star power? As is the case with everyone else on this lineup of embarrassing failure, I had to look up this trio of unknowns. Evan Cohen, he is coming from satellite radio where he hosted a show called Morning Men. Well, at least he's got radio experience. For the past year, Michelle Smallman, she has been responsible for giving the overnight Sports Center updates on ESPN Radio, which is why it wasn't all that surprising when I found out that she's got 13,000 followers on social media. Some dumbass sitting in his backyard studio's got nearly 75,000 and a monthly audience of 2 million. A personality on ESPN Radio, 13,000. And Chris Canty is an absolute disaster. You know, one of the skills required for radio, you've got to be able to coherently speak. Chris Canty is constantly fumbling over his own words. The only time he speaks clearly is when he's highlighting cases of mythical racism. According to Norby Williamson, who is the executive editor at ESPN Radio and a leading candidate for a name change, all of the pieces magically came together for this exciting new lineup of failure. This team is incredibly diverse, which should please consumers of the diversity dong. The morning show will captivate listeners with content only found on ESPN Radio. Yeah, I happen to agree because outside of the WNBA, ESPN Radio is now the only place where you can find garbage. It is clear that ESPN had diversity in mind when creating this new morning show, but what about the rest of the lineup? You follow up that travesty with Mike Greenberg, who is becoming increasingly more irrelevant with each passing day. If I were Mike Greenberg, I would use the gigantic forehead of Stephen A. Smith as a life raft and jump off this sinking Titanic. Mikey G is followed up with another pair of unknowns, Chris Carlin and Joe Fortenbaugh. I didn't bother to look up Chris Carlin. I mean, honestly, who cares? I did spend a few minutes, though, looking up Joe Fortenbaugh because his name sounded familiar. According to ESPN, he is a sports betting analyst. Translation: he will bankrupt you. This is a bullshit title. There is no such thing as a sports betting analyst. These are fake experts that know just enough about sports betting to be dangerous. Take it from a guy who's been running a sports book for many years now. Take it from someone who has watched gamblers take the advice of these pretend analysts, who's watched gamblers pay thousands of dollars for the advice of these so-called gambling experts. When it comes to sports betting, there is only one winner: the house. You will always lose. You know why sportsbooks set up point spreads? Most people think it's to even the odds because one team is better than the other, and that's definitely a part of it. But odds makers, they also set these point spreads to entice you to bet how they want you to bet. I can tell you how many times I've noticed a line that seems sketchy. I go check the books. Damn near every player is on that side, and it almost always loses. But anyway, ESPN follows the fake gambling expert with Freddie Coleman and Harry Douglas. By this point in the lineup, I had gotten tired of looking up these anonymous people, so I just stopped doing it. That disaster is followed by Amber and N. Who are they? Who knows and who cares? Sounds like a young married couple who will be divorced by the time they reach 30. Maybe they'll be one of the lucky ones who got married young and stayed together. Maybe, just maybe, they'll stand the test of time. I'll tell you what won't stand the test of time: their show on ESPN Radio. And finally, the late night hours on ESPN Radio will be filled by someone named Q. Maybe this was another diversity hire? Perhaps executives wanted someone who identified with the Q and LGBTQ to represent the questionables on ESPN Radio. Q is a hip-hop DJ from San Francisco. What does he know about sports? Probably as much as everyone else working at ESPN. Nothing. The vast majority of the personalities included in this new lineup at ESPN Radio, they have got less influence and less of a following than the YouTubers that you guys watch every day. What does that tell you? ESPN got these people for cheap. They are paying Pat McAfee millions of dollars, and instead of utilizing him on both television and radio, they're paying some dude named Q. This is the final nail in the coffin of ESPN Radio. Now, obviously, ESPN did this on purpose, but the question is, why? Even though ESPN Radio was already destroyed by Bomani Jones, why would they defecate on their own grave? I think it's because ESPN's going to be sold. I'm not an expert in business, but from my minimal knowledge, when companies are preparing themselves to be sold, they begin cutting costs. ESPN's cut costs with payroll. They've laid off thousands of people. They've eliminated high-priced television personalities. They're going the cheap route with ESPN Radio. They are shopping ownership stakes in ESPN to major sports leagues like the NFL and the NBA. I actually saw a report earlier today where Apple is possibly interested in acquiring ESPN. That would be a disaster. Apple has shown many times that they are dedicated to Wiener. Wasn't Apple the same company that introduced the emoji of the pregnant man? Yeah. That is one of the companies interested in buying this dump. ESPN would have been better off just shutting their radio division down. Now, maybe they couldn't do that because they were bound by contracts with their affiliates, but at the same time, what affiliate is going to be pleased with this new lineup? This new lineup is absolutely atrocious. Their only star is Mike Greenberg, and his star is fading. Give me your thoughts on this lineup. Does this signal that ESPN is officially giving up on radio? Does it signal that ESPN is cutting costs for a possible acquisition? Or maybe a combination of both? Have you heard of any of these people? Am I the only one that's never heard of them? You let me know. Sound off in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell to receive all notifications from the channel. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys tomorrow.